Okay, so welcome class. By the time you see this, I will have already spoken to you synchronously on Tuesday night for our first class, but I'm excited about today to introduce you to someone who I have been following his work for quite some time, and it's really just so appropriate to bring him into this early conversation that I want to have with you guys about ethics in the context of digital culture. In the past, what you may have heard from some of your classmates and students who have taken this already is that we generally focus a lot on praxis and the nitty-gritty of getting into how you actually manage media in different contexts. But given all of the landscapes, we'll say, in our nation and in our world right now, they're socio-political or health, all these different things that are intimately tied to our digital ecosystems. I really want to spend a week or two talking about how we might reconsider, reimagine, and whatever phrase you want to use, doing media management in this landscape. And I think we bear a lot of responsibility that many people, even in the industry, don't consider. So we're going to use this time, about 35 minutes. I'm going to talk to Dr. Kevin Healey, who I have here with me. So Dr. Healey, he is Associate Professor of Communication at University of New Hampshire. Has his PhD from the University of Illinois. He received the Communication Ethics Teaching Award from the National Communication Association a couple years ago, 2018. He's written for Salon, Huffington Post, and he's published numerous academic books and journals. He's also the co-author of the book that I have here, which I recommend. It's called Ethics and Religion in the Age of Social Media, Digital Proverbs for Responsible Citizens. And I really wanted to have him on because we were talking just before we started this interview. And as you guys know, there's a lot of polarization, particularly political polarization in our culture and society. Increasingly, too, I think digital media is influencing our personal lives in ways that we had anticipated, but it's just becoming more and more acute, whether it's behavioral issues with children, attention deficit disorder, sense of isolation, higher levels of depression, lack of inability to socialize. All these different things are how media are influencing people. And as media manager practitioners, and we'll get into some of this as we get into some of the questions with Dr. Healey, but I really just think this is an essential part of this conversation in this class. What I'm going to do is sort of let Kevin give us, I hope I can call you Kevin, is that okay?
Sure, yeah.
And I'd like to sort of you to talk a few minutes about your background. What got you interested in ethics and morality in the context of digital cultures? Sort of what got you into it in the first place, and then where you sort of see your research fitting into the current discussion.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction, by the way, Chase. That was very nice. I think that's the first time someone has said to me that they've been following my work. So thank you. But I was thinking as you were talking to your students, I should mention that I do have some professional background in media production, which your students might find interesting. I worked in New York City or Silicon Alley for 6 or 7 years for various websites doing content production, content management. I worked for some for-profits who were in the music industry and for some not-for-profits. Actually, there was a moment when Crane's New York Business did a story, not a feature story, but a story about people who are leaving the dot-com bubble companies to go work for nonprofits. So I was part of that little story that they did. So that you could say that was the moment when I started really thinking about the ethics of digital media and digital culture, because I felt compelled to leave the for-profit dot-com industry. I became a little bit cynical about the whole enterprise. And I started working for nonprofits doing content management as a consultant, and then as a full-time employee. I worked for the March of Dimes for about 3 years before going back to school. And then maybe some of your students know Clifford Christians. He was my mentor, sort of intellectual guru in media ethics for a lot of people. And I went to University of Illinois because he was there. And also because Robert McChesney was there, who does sort of critical political economy. So it's those two mentors who my work hopefully sort of captures and integrates them in some way. And I've always had an interest in religion and ethics and the overlap of those things. I teach a course on media, religion, and culture. So I see these different elements coming together. And as you've read the book, I mean, that's part of how the book is structured, is that if you were to do a Venn diagram, there's sort of religion, ethics, and digital culture. And this book tries to show how they're all related to each other.
Sure, and I think that really the language that you use, and again, I encourage students to pick up a copy of the book if you can. The language that you and your co-author Robert Woods uses, the catechism of the moral catechism of
Right.
Silicon Valley, and so that to me provides a really interesting framework. It's a tool by which you're, for lack of a better phrase, indoctrinating someone into a specific set of beliefs. So, in the context of some religion and catechism, when you're a child, you go through this, you learn the various creeds and the various sort of steps and things that are right and wrong, all these different things. In the context of Silicon Valley, obviously, there's not an explicit catechism where if you sign up for Facebook, you're taken through a course about what is right and wrong, but it's the implicit practices and
Yeah.
the meaning that is embedded in these systems that implicitly cultivate this. So could you talk about that a little bit? What is that? What do you mean by that? And what are the 5 sort of points that you guys talk about?
Sure. And I should say, I mean, it's good that I mentioned Robert McChesney, Bob McChesney. He used the term catechism in one of his books, which I think it was Digital Disconnect, which I used to assign for my digital democracies class. And I'm pretty sure that's the book where he used the phrase catechism. Now, he was using it to refer to assumptions about markets and sort of the beneficence of markets and how we should trust in markets. But I liked that framing, and I can credit him with that term. But then in the work that I did and that Robert and I are doing in this book, we're using it a little bit more expansively than that to refer to a set of ethical propositions, which, as you suggest, are sort of implicit. They don't necessarily have to be, they don't have to hit you over the head with it, because it's sort of implied within the practices of digital culture. Although, as you were saying that, I keep remembering scenes, you see photographs from the headquarters of Facebook where there's sort of, what would you call them? Not mottos, but little sayings that are posted all around the headquarters. I mean, it's implicit in those too. So maybe in some moments they are hitting you over the head with it. So maybe it's a mixture of both. But in any case, so to me, it occurred to me at some point that there's some distinctions that we fail to make between human virtues and our technological capacities. And the first couple of these that I wrote about a few years ago now, maybe 4 years ago now, was that information is not wisdom and that transparency is not authenticity. So that was the first set. And I thought, that those distinctions are good, but there's more of those. And the problem is that it's not that these things aren't related to each other. They're obviously related, but the problem in our digital culture is that we tend to elide those different categories. We fail to make the distinction. And in doing so, it leads to a whole sort of set of problems. So I thought we should articulate what all of these things are. And in the book, we get to 5 of them, but then we also suggest there are more than just these 5. And I hope we sort of encourage people to find others and articulate them. But they are: information is not wisdom, transparency is not authenticity, convergence is not integrity, processing is not judgment, and storage is not memory. Some of the other ones that we have also written about are connectivity is not intimacy. That's another example of it. I would encourage people to just keep pursuing that line of thought and see which other ones you think we are failing, the distinctions we're failing to make. So the idea of the catechism is that this is a kind of moral catechism, that we're conflating human virtues like wisdom and integrity with specific technological capacities. So the catechism of Silicon Valley makes these, fails to make these distinctions. So Silicon Valley has this set of assumptions that we're calling the catechism, which is that information is equivalent to wisdom, transparency is equivalent to authenticity, convergence is integrity, processing is judgment, storage is memory.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, part of the book is identifying what you guys term the moral catechism, which is um, uh, citing what the problem is. Right. This is the assumed moral framework under which Silicon Valley propagates its ethos of human interaction with their products. Right. Just last night, as I told Kevin before we started, I watched a much hyped documentary. Some of you guys have maybe seen it on Netflix. It's called The Social Dilemma. It touches on a lot of these same issues. Obviously, doesn't use the same sort of framework for analyzing it, but it's the filmmakers interview a cadre of these ex tech big players from Google, Facebook, Instagram that have essentially been sounding the alarm for the last few years about uh, all of the things that the dystopian nightmares that we sort of joke about how number one about surveillance capitalism and number two about how the psychological problems that are emerging from surveillance capitalism and the way these algorithms at different institutions influence us are having much even deeper and broader and more malignant impact on our life than we even jokingly think about. So it's in one sense, it's a very pessimistic documentary. So if you watch it, I'll just warn you that I came away from it thinking a little bit. Uh, it was definitely a different feeling when I came away from it from reading the book, because the book at least provides some framework of like, okay, this is the way we can begin to address it. In the film, interestingly, um, they they present at the beginning of the most telling thing to me about the whole film is the very beginning. They're like, yeah, we're headed down a terrible path. And then the filmmaker says, okay, well, if this is the issue, what's the main driver? Is it any one person's fault? Is it any one variable's fault? And all of them just kind of scratch their head and nobody has an answer, or at least they present. And then after they go through this whole thing about showing how bad it is, at the very end, most of them seem to land on the answer, more regulation. And not to say, I don't mean to say that I don't think regulation plays a part. I think it does. And obviously, that's a hugely complex issue that we're talking about right now in the news with how technology companies censor and all these different things. It's a huge conversation. But that to me, it was interesting to me that was the only answer that they seemed to come up with was some kind of regulation. So I think there are more nuanced ways. And I think it's important for us as media managers. You know, you guys are in this class because you want to practice media management. And even though, you know, most of us probably won't go and work for Facebook and Google and these places that create the algorithms that influence these conversations, we're still relying on and leveraging these platforms as you buy advertisements, as you uh, write budgets and decide which kind of channels you're going to use to promote your product or service. Also, too, just as consumers, we're influenced by it just as much as we are in our career. So there's a lot of overlap, and I would encourage you again to watch that film. We'll talk about it a little bit more in subsequent weeks. But just to build on that, Kevin, I want to ask you. So, how do you see in your research for the book? How do you think that the catechism that's sort of in place, this moral construct that is being propagated through Silicon Valley, how do you think it affects our ability? And when I say our, I mean us as users and consumers of the technologies to make wise choices. You mentioned in your book that we are passive online. We're very passive in some ways. Could you elaborate on that just a bit?
Sure. Actually, if you don't mind me sharing a thought in response to what you were just saying,
Sure.
You were mentioning the social dilemma, and in your notes to me, you mentioned that it seems a little cynical and negative. I always recommend to students or require them to watch a two-part Frontline documentary called The Facebook Dilemma. If you haven't seen that, I recommend watching both of those also. It's really well sourced and reported, and it also does focus on regulation to some degree, but I think it does a really good job. I wanted to make a point about in the book, in terms of responding to the situation, what we call a crisis, the digital crisis, we suggest that we need to take an approach that is kind of critical yet hopeful. And this might be helpful for your students, this distinction, because I teach a seminar in media ethics, and this is the distinction I make. First of all, the book takes the framework of virtue ethics. So all of these ideas, wisdom, integrity, authenticity, these are human virtues. And the way that virtue ethics conceives of these virtues is that they're always sort of a middle ground, midpoint, or golden mean between two extremes, which can be considered vices. And so to me, hope is a sort of middle ground between the two extremes of, on the one hand, you have cynicism and despair, which might be a little of the flavor that you're getting from The Social Dilemma and other sort of dystopian novels and things and movies that are out there.
Sure.
But then on the other hand, there's the other extreme is kind of naive idealism, which is also problematic. And you get a little bit more of that from, the tech leaders in Silicon Valley, like, trust in, Google's motto for a long time was, don't do evil.
Right.
I think at some point they decided that there was too much sort of cognitive dissonance for everyone to keep having that as their motto.
Right.
But so we try to say, okay, to be hopeful, to bring a sort of spirit or a feeling of hope about the future, you have to sort of toe this middle line between cynicism and despair on the one hand, and then naive idealism on the other hand. And what's interesting about that distinction is that you don't need hope. Now, usually people confuse hope with naivete, but that's not how it really works in my opinion. That hope is always active and it's imaginative and creative. And the distinction I make with students is that interestingly and maybe surprisingly, hope isn't necessary in either of these extreme positions. Because if you're completely cynical and in despair, there's nothing you can do about it. It's just messed up and we're headed towards disaster. On the other hand, if you're too naive and idealistic, you don't have to. There's no need for hope because it's all you just sit back and let the algorithms take over, and we'll all be, to quote from a poem in the '60s, we'll all be watched over by machines of loving grace. So the hope isn't on either of those extremes. It's in the middle. And so it's active and engaged. So to me, the hope is being able to see reality for what it is and the problems and the benefits, but then also to envision at the same time an alternate way of doing things that is possible, and to sort of be and live as if we can bring that into being. So now to get back to your question, about how the catechism interferes with, I think it interferes with that process of engaged, imaginative, creative hope. Because depending where depending which moment you're at or which position you're at, and what kind of stakeholder you are in digital culture, the assumption that information is wisdom or that transparency is authenticity can sort of push us to those extremes, where hope is either not necessary or it's nowhere to be found. So if we, in terms of tech leadership, they'll say, now that we have this amazing algorithmic processing, we can replace so many things that used to take human beings so much time. So we can just replace human beings with, like we can use AI and machine learning to hire people to do our hiring, or to do our policing or preemptive policing, or to assist the law enforcement process. And we can give AI platforms to judges so they can sort of predict who's going to violate parole or something like that. Okay, that that is problematic because what it does is it displaces our active engagement in the pursuit of virtue, which is both an individual thing and a collective thing that we do with each other. So I think that sort of gets at your question. How does the catechism interfere? It pushes us to different extremes, both of which can be easily commercialized, by the way. There's a lot of sort of what I call ka-ching on either of those extremes. You can find movies that are sort of utopian and dystopian. And both of those extremes are sort of clickbait. So the system functions for some people very well, and for the rest of us, not so well.
Right. A lot of the ideals from which the catechism come from were they were benevolent ideals, right? They were the idea of having, democratization of media is a phrase that you used to hear a lot. And that's where all these Google and Wikipedia and all these things, making more information accessible to all. Facebook with the idea is connect, reduce barriers to connect. And it's not as if, there hasn't been good that have come from these technologies. But at the same time, anytime you introduce a technology in a capitalistic system, there will be actors who influence it in such a way to monetize it, right? And when you're developing a media management plan, say you're working at Nike, you're going to adopt whatever platforms can make you the most money because they're driven by profit. That's what businesses do. And so these algorithms become problematic because you become a digital persona to them that is a collection of metrics, just disregarding the whole notion of online privacy. But once they have that information, all of your online interactions are shaped and influenced according to what makes that company the most money. And obviously, you're not just interacting with one or two nodes, right? You've got these companies you like and these political platforms you like, and then it all manifests according to the algorithms on your feed, right? Whatever feeds you visit all the time. So, it's not as if everybody is seeing the same content and we're starting from the same place. And I think that's really where one of the biggest issues is people think that their commercial activity and their quote unquote personal interest don't influence their psychology, their likes and dislikes in terms of ideologies. But the truth is that the way a lot of these platforms are set up is that they're going to monetize everything. So if they can make the connection in the algorithm between this kind of political ideology and this kind of product, that connection is being made to make more money. And I don't want to oversimplify it. It's obviously more complex than that. Mm-hmm. But I think we need to understand that we're being influenced. I think we feel like we're sort of the masters of our own domain on social media, and we're definitely being influenced a lot more than we imagine. And so as media managers, obviously I'm not suggesting, as you say, there's the whole completely skeptical, completely optimistic. We got to be somewhere in the middle with hope. And as practitioners, be at least cognizant. I mean, we're not going to be able to tear down these structures and do something completely different, but be able to operate within them in some kind of ethical way that is at least aware of and accounts for how they can change us in fundamentally bad ways. And I mean, there's not a whole lot of evidence beyond just look at the state that we're in right now in political discourse to say that there is a potential for very bad things to happen unless we somehow come to a consensus on what to do about it. Because I think, that's sort of where I sit in this class. I said at the beginning, I want to re-envision this class, not out of some sort of hopeful idealism or just despair, but in some way to practically engage the kinds of systems. Because, at the end of the class, the students will work in groups to author a media management plan. So they'll identify organization or business, look at their brand and say, okay, how could we restructure the branding of this particular institution or business according to, XYZ variables. And every semester students pitch, okay, let's put this amount of money on Facebook. Let's put this, you're tailoring the plan according to your business goals, but they're always business goals. And I don't think there's anything wrong. I'm not the kind of person who's going to say, I don't think the profit motive or capitalism as objectively bad things.
Mhm.
I think we have to at least start taking into account like just how much impact beyond buying and selling our actions have. And so that's sort of where I wanted to
Mhm.
situate
Mhm.
the conversation. There's one quote.
Yeah.
We're coming up on 30 minutes, so I won't keep you much
Okay.
longer. There was a quote on here um, from the Social Dilemma that's very striking. It's if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. And
Mhm.
so, a lot of people think that Google and Facebook and all these things are relatively free. I mean, obviously, you have to pay for your device and the internet connection, but generally speaking, we conceive of these things as being quote unquote free. But they're not. The majority of the cost of these platforms are being paid. The reason Facebook, you can sign up for Facebook for free, is because advertisers, right? Advertising revenue drives the business model. So Facebook is no longer catering to you. You're the product. Your attention is the product,
Mhm.
and the advertisers are then the audience.
Yes.
So they're going to be building their product and changing their product according to what the advertisers want, and the advertisers want to make money on you. So this business model is problematic, and so I think we just need to again figure out how to engage that. The last thing, I'll just kind of read one more quote here,
Yeah.
and I'll just have you respond to it, Kevin, and see what you think, and we'll sort of close. So this is by a guy's named Jaron Lanier. He's a computer
Yeah.
scientist. He's one of the guys who pioneered virtual reality. He said, "We've created a world in which online connection has become primary, especially for younger generations. And yet, in that world, anytime two people connect, the only way it's financed is through a third party who's paying to manipulate those two people. So we've created an entire global generation of people who are raised within a context with the very meaning of communication. The very meaning of culture is manipulation."
I love Jaron Lanier. He's such a character.
He is, yeah.
I think he raises goats. And I love to show my students pictures of Jaron Lanier. He has these long dreadlocks, and
Yeah.
but he knows his stuff. I mean, he is not a Luddite. He's speaking as an insider. And yes, in this quote, he's suggesting that at least the current state of things tends to be manipulative. But I think maybe a way of framing it is that what we're looking to do is to move from a situation where you have two people interacting with each other, like you and I are interacting right now, and Lanier is suggesting that there's some third party that has a stake in manipulating both of us, sort of unbeknownst to us, or sort of unwittingly, or maybe we sort of tacitly know what's going on, but we don't really have another choice because Zoom is the only, or Facebook is the only, Google is the only platform, whatever. Um, what if we moved from a situation, a context of manipulation to cultivation? So in the context of virtue ethics, what we're looking to cultivate, you and I, what we're looking to cultivate in this context, our conversation, and then the students who are listening, we're looking to cultivate wisdom. We're looking to cultivate authenticity and integrity. We're looking long term, we're looking to cultivate memory. And that's clearly important in the current context when everybody's saying, what can we learn from the 1918 flu pandemic, or what can we learn from this historical precedent? So the idea is that we throw out complex technological systems. We don't even need to necessarily throw out the types of platforms that we have now, but we need to move away from a context of manipulation or business models built on manipulation towards a sort of consensual cultivation. I know what I'm doing when I enter into this conversation, and you come at it with your own intention for what we want to cultivate, what we want the process to yield, and the platforms should raise those things up. The problem now is that the platforms tend to have sort of ulterior motives, as you're suggesting, that the ulterior motive has to do with profit, which tends to be contemptuous of privacy issues, and it tends to have a kind of cynical attitude towards user interests. The one nuance I would add to your earlier comment, you were suggesting that the platforms don't really cater to us, they cater to advertisers. I would just add a little to that by saying they cater to users insofar as users' interests are easily commodifiable. So there's a sort of set of interests that we have that are potentially exploitable for commercial interests. But if I'm interested, for example, in moving away from advertising altogether, like there used to be, surveys about whether during the broadcast television era, they would survey people, and people didn't want so much advertising on TV. Well, that's not really an interest that the industry can cater to very easily because it's antithetical to the whole system. So it's what we end up doing is catering to that particular subset of user interests that fits into the system. So this gets to your earlier point, which I think you were sort of getting at, the assumption of technological neutrality.
Right.
Technological systems are not neutral. They tend to amplify either the sort of sets of values that are already on the ground, but more likely, depending on the economic system and the business model, they amplify certain aspects of what's already on the ground, and they might diminish other aspects.
Sure.
So to me, a commercial media system, it aims for the low-hanging fruit. So the vices, our proclivity for greed and lust and all of those things. Those are easy to translate into a sort of ka-ching or clicks.
Yeah, and we're gonna Nick. That's a great segue, as it were, to next week. We'll be talking about the social contract sort of, and what we sort of give up, right? In terms, we acknowledge when we click on the Facebook terms of agreement what we're giving up because it's out of convenience, and sort of how we might rethink that. I have my own. I think we all have our own personal convictions about uh, human nature, right, and how different things can exacerbate the worst in us and the best in us. And but it's not sort of, I guess, my job, even though sometimes I would like to proselytize or push some particular ideology. I really, I think it's best for us to look at, um, as you said, virtue ethics and how we can cultivate instead of fall victim to manipulation. So, but Kevin, I appreciate it very much, and I will definitely be referencing this as throughout the semester as we keep going.